She hired her to clean the house. She never imagined she was already family. For 6 months, a Korean billionaire's mother tormented her black housekeeper, calling her every ugly name her culture had for outsiders, until the day she discovered the truth. The woman she saw as a servant was wearing her son's wedding ring, and the secret they'd kept would shatter her world. This is the story of a secret that burned at the intersection of Korea's deepest taboos: family honor, racial purity, and colossal wealth. It begins with Lee Jae-hyun, a 34-year-old tech billionaire, and Amina, a Nigerian data scientist he met at a conference in Berlin. They married in a private ceremony in Denmark, but to bring her home to Seoul's rigid high society, he devised a desperate, degrading plan. He made his own wife his mother's live-in maid. Jae-hyun's reasoning was a cold calculus. His mother, Madame Lee Soo-jin, was the gatekeeper not just to family approval, but to the old money alliances that propped up his new tech empire. Her word could freeze investors, sway board members, and her prejudice was legendary. She once said, at a charity gala loud enough for the waitstaff to hear, that multiculturalism was a Western fashion that would stain Korea's beautiful homogeneity. To her, a foreign daughter-in-law, especially a black one, would be a social death sentence. So the lie was born. Amina would enter the household on an E9 domestic worker visa, sponsored by Jae-hyun's own company. Her doctoral degree in machine learning was erased from the record he showed his mother. In its place was a forged dossier from a fictional agency in Lagos, listing her skills as cooking, cleaning, and elderly care. The ultimate disguise was invisibility. Who looks twice at the help? Madame Lee's penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of the Gangnam Tower. It wasn't a home. It was a statement in glass, steel, and curated antique celadon. When Amina first stood at the service entrance that March, she felt the weight of the performance settle on her shoulders. She wore a simple grey dress, her locks tied back. The butler led her through a gallery of white marble, past a wall-sized painting of a mountain that cost more than her entire family's home in Port Harcourt. In the sunroom, she met her new employer. Lee Soo-jin was 70, with silver hair coiled in an elegant chignon and eyes the color of flint. She did not smile. She surveyed Amina from the silk cushions of her divan, a queen holding court. "You are Nigerian," she stated. "You will speak only when spoken to. You will not use the main elevator. You will address me as Madame Lee asterisk. Do you understand the hierarchy of this house?" Amina bowed her head, the movement feeling like a fracture. "Yes, Madame Lee." The first week was a study in silent degradation. Amina's real world, conferences, peer-reviewed papers, debugging code with Jae-hyun over midnight coffee vanished. Her new world was starching table linens, polishing silver that had never been used, and learning which direction the morning sun should hit Madame Lee's orchids. Jae-hyun was a ghost in his own home, leaving before dawn, returning late, communicating with his wife through secret notes left in a hollowed-out book in the library. The distance was a physical ache, but then something unexpected began to happen. Amina was tasked with reading the international finance news to Madame Lee each morning. One day, she corrected the translator's subtle error in a Reuters article about African sovereign debt. Madame Lee's flinty eyes flicked up from her tea. "You understand bond yields?" Amina froze, then retreated. "A little from my previous household." A lie layered on a lie, but a door had cracked open. The careful dance of deception was punctuated by Jae-hyun's staged interactions. He would pass Amina in the hallway, his voice cold, corporate. "The east balcony needs attention." Once his mother was watching, and he added, "And be quicker about it." That night he found Amina weeping silently in their hidden bedroom in the servants' wing. He held her, whispering apologies into her hair. "It's temporary. Once the merger is secured, once she's dependent on your care, we'll tell her. She'll have to accept you." But the plan had a flaw they hadn't accounted for. Proximity breeds familiarity, and familiarity can curdle into contempt or soften into something else. Amina discovered Madame Lee's obsession, Django asterisk drums. A set of beautiful, dust-covered drums sat in a corner of the music room. One afternoon, while cleaning, Amina's hand brushed the skin of the drum. Madame Lee's voice sliced through the room. "Do not touch that, your hands are for cleaning." The venom was precise. Later, Amina would learn from the old gardener that Madame Lee's late husband, a famed traditional musician, had played them. The drums were a shrine to a lost career she believed was being erased. This was the core of her prejudice, not just race, but a terror of cultural loss, a fear that her world was dissolving. Amina filed this away. Understanding your enemy is the first step to survival. Turning point came on a rainy Tuesday in April. Madame Li was frustrated with a new smart home system Jaihan had installed. It wouldn't respond to her commands. Amina, dusting nearby, watched her jab at the tablet in frustration. Useless technology, Madame Li muttered. Without thinking, Amina spoke. The voice recognition is calibrated for a deeper pitch. May I? She took the tablet, her fingers flying across the settings menu, recalibrating the acoustic model in 30 seconds. The system chimed. Hello, Madame Li. The old woman stared first at the obedient device, then at Amina, not with gratitude but with deep, unsettling suspicion. Where does a housemaid learn such things? The air in the room turned to ice. Amina's mind raced. She had just broken the most important rule, never stand out. In that suspended moment, the entire fragile deception hung by a thread. And in Madame Li's eyes, Amina saw not just suspicion, but the first spark of a dangerous, calculating curiosity. Madame Li's silent treatment was a weapon. For 3 days, she spoke to Amina only in sharp, necessary commands, but her eyes were everywhere watching, cataloging. Amina moved through the penthouse like a ghost, but she felt the weight of that gaze. The suspicion had been planted, and in the sterile soil of Madame Li's prejudice, it began to grow. Jaihan, panicking, told Amina to lean into the maid persona completely, to make mistakes, to seem simpler. It felt like swallowing broken glass. She forced herself to mispronounce tech terms, to pretend confusion over the espresso machine. But every forced error made Madame Li's lips tighten, not in satisfaction, but in deeper doubt. A performance that's too perfect is a flag. A performance that suddenly becomes clumsy is a confession. The first crack in the fortress came from an unexpected source. The garden. Madame Li's prized collection of *Mokran orchids was dying, a silent crisis in ceramic pots. The gardener, an old man who'd served the family for 40 years, was baffled. Amina, who had grown up helping her botanist mother in a university greenhouse in Ibadan, recognized the signs instantly, a specific root fungus thriving in the penthouse's overhumidified air. One evening, as the gardener lamented, she whispered a suggestion in halting Korean. Try a cinnamon powder paste on the cut roots. It's a natural antifungal. She said it was an old Nigerian folk remedy. A week later, new green shoots appeared. The gardener, grateful, mentioned the wise folk trick to Madame Li. This time there was no praise, only a cold, calculated silence. A housemaid from Lagos who understood bond yields and orchid phytopathology. The story was unraveling. Madame Li began her own investigation. She called the agency listed on Amina's forged dossier. The number, meticulously set up by Jaihan's assistant, held. But she didn't stop there. She had her personal secretary dig deeper into Nigerian immigration records for students on academic visas in Germany around the time Jaihan was in Berlin. The search was a shot in the dark, fueled by a mother's paranoia and a socialite's resources. Meanwhile, the external pressure Jaihan feared was materializing. The chairman of the old guard conglomerate he needed for his merger, a man named Choi Min-ho, began pressing for a more personal alliance. He had a daughter, recently returned from an MBA at Stanford. Our children should meet, Choi said over a round of golf, his tone leaving no room for interpretation. It was a demand disguised as a suggestion. Jaihan's carefully constructed timeline was collapsing. Inside the penthouse, a twisted intimacy forged in deception began to grow. Madame Li, perhaps as a test, asked Amina to read to her from the English-language financial papers every afternoon. She would then debate the analysis, her questions sharp, probing. Without realizing it, she was engaging in the intellectual sparring she missed from her late husband. Amina, careful to cloak her insights in simple language, found herself actually enjoying the mental exercise. One afternoon, discussing a tech startup's valuation, Amina let a term slip, latent variable model, a term far beyond any maid's lexicon. She immediately tried to cover it, calling it a fancy word for a guess. Madame Li just stared out the window at the Seoul skyline, her expression unreadable. Leave me, she said quietly. That night, she accessed a private detective's preliminary report. It contained a grainy, photocopied student ID photo from a technical university in Berlin. The face was younger, the hair different, but the eyes were unmistakable. It was Amina. The name beside it was not the one on the maid's contract. It was Dr. Amina Nwachukwu. Confrontation was inevitable, but its form was a shock. Madame Li didn't accuse Amina. She cornered her son. She waited until he was in her private study, reviewing the merger documents. She placed the grainy student photo on top of the financial projections. "Who is this woman cleaning my house, Jai-hun?" Her voice was dangerously calm. Jai-hun's world froze. He stammered, weaving a new lie about a brilliant student who fell on hard times, whom he was charitably employing. Madame Lee listened, her eyes like chips of ice. When he finished, she said only, "You are a poor liar like your father." She dismissed him. Her next move was not emotional, but strategic. She summoned her lawyer and requested a full, urgent audit of the domestic staff visa sponsorships under Jai-hun's corporate entity. She was no longer looking for a personal truth. She was building a legal case. Amina, sensing the net tightening, made a desperate play of her own. During her evening cleaning of Jai-hun's home office, she used his computer, with a password she knew, to access the merger deal room. She wasn't looking for company secrets. She was looking at Chairman Choi. What she found was a pattern of shell companies and offshore holdings that suggested not just old money, but dirty money. Choi's conglomerate was deeply entangled with a controversial mining operation in Southeast Asia, one with multiple human rights complaints. This was the leverage Jai-hun needed. She compiled a dossier, not as Amina the maid, but as Dr. Nwachukwu the data analyst, tracing the digital paper trail. She left it, anonymous, on Jai-hun's encrypted drive with a single note. "Use this to break the engagement, not the merger." But the walls were closing in. Madame Lee's audit request triggered an alert in Jai-hun's legal department. The fabricated agency in Lagos wouldn't withstand official scrutiny. Jai-hun, in a panic, told Amina they might have to run, to leave Korea and declare the marriage publicly from afar. Amina refused. "We run, and she wins. She gets to keep her perfect world and her racist peace. I didn't marry you to live in hiding." For the first time, the fundamental conflict between them surfaced. Jai-hun wanted to manage the problem. Amina wanted to break it. The explosion happened on the eve of the arranged dinner with Choi and his daughter. Madame Lee, in a fury of preparation, ordered Amina to prepare a specific, incredibly complex traditional dessert, yaksik asterisk. It was a test designed for failure, requiring knowledge and skill no foreign maid could possess. Amina worked through the night in the kitchen, following a recipe on her phone, her hands trembling. The result was passable, but not perfect. When Madame Lee inspected it, she didn't criticize the food. She looked at Amina's exhausted face and said, "You try so hard to be what you are not. It must be exhausting." Then she dropped the bomb. "My investigator found your doctoral thesis, Neural Networks for Predictive Resource Extraction. Impressive. Tell me, doctor, what is the going rate for a data scientist to play housemaid, or is the payment my son?" Amina's mask shattered. The months of humiliation, of silence, boiled over. "The payment is not your son," she said, her voice low and clear, abandoning all pretense. "The payment is a life with the man I love, a life you would deny us because my skin is the wrong color for your family portrait." The air crackled. Madame Lee, for the first time, was speechless, not from anger, but from the sheer, undiluted truth of the attack. Before she could form a reply, the intercom buzzed. Chairman Choi and his daughter had arrived early. The battlefield shifted instantly. The dinner was a surreal torture. Amina, back in her maid's uniform, served the courses under Madame Lee's glare and Choi Min-ho's casually dismissive gaze. His daughter Yuna was polite, beautiful, and perfectly suited to be the heir's bride. Jai-hun was cordial, trapped. During the main course, Choi, emboldened by fine wine, made a joke about needing to hire strong, cheap labor from Africa for his new factory. The table froze. Jai-hun's knuckles were white on his fork. Amina, refilling water glasses, kept her eyes down. But then Yuna Choi spoke, her voice sweet. "Father, that's an outdated view. Some of the most innovative tech talent is coming from Africa now. I read a paper just last week by a Dr. Nwachukwu on AI in mineralogy. Brilliant work." She looked directly at Amina as she said the name, a tiny, ambiguous smile on her lips. Did she know? Was it a coincidence? The moment passed, but a new, terrifying variable had entered the equation. After the guests left, the penthouse was a tomb. Madame Lee retired without a word. Jai-hun pulled Amina into a hidden alcove. "We have to end this. Now, tomorrow I tell her everything." But it was too late. In her suite, Madame Lee was not sleeping. She was on the phone with her lawyer, her voice steel. "The visa sponsorship is fraudulent. The woman is here under false pretenses. I want her removed from the household immediately. Start the immigration proceedings." She was going to have Amina deported. But as she hung up, she looked at the student ID photo again, then at a recent family portrait of Jai-hun. She saw the same determined set of the jaw, the same light in the eyes when discussing something they loved. A horrifying, undeniable truth was dawning on her. Her son loved this woman, and in exposing the fraud to destroy her, she would destroy him. She was caught in a trap of her own making. The next morning, she confronted Amina one last time, not in anger, but in cold, final negotiation. "You will leave this house today. You will sign annulment papers. My son will marry Yuna Choi. In return, I will not press charges. You can return to your country with a generous severance." Amina looked at the woman who had tormented her, who held all the legal and social cards, and she smiled. It was not a smile of defeat, but of revelation. "Madame Lee," she said softly, pulling her phone from her apron pocket. "Before I answer, you should listen to something." She pressed play. It was a clear audio recording of Choi Min-ho from last night's dinner, detailing his plans to bypass environmental regulations using shell companies. It was the audio companion to the data dossier. Amina had recorded the entire conversation. "You want me to leave to protect your family's name," Amina said. "But if I leave, this gets sent to every major news outlet and financial regulator in the country. Your precious merger won't just die. Your family name will be tied to an international scandal. You have a choice. Lose a daughter-in-law you hate or lose everything you love." It was checkmate. Madame Lee stared, not at a maid, but at a strategist who had outmaneuvered her in her own palace. The power in the room shifted irrevocably. But as the shock settled, a new, more terrifying question emerged in Madame Lee's eyes. If this was what the maid could do, who exactly had her son married? The silence that followed wasn't surrender. It was a ceasefire, brokered on a foundation of mutually assured destruction. Madame Lee looked at the phone in Amina's hand, then at her face, and saw no bluff. The maid had transformed in that instant into a rival sovereign power. She nodded once, a sharp, mechanical movement. "The dinner with the Chois is off. The merger will proceed on financial terms alone." It was the first concession of her life, but the victory was hollow and fraught. Amina was still a maid in the household, and Jai-hun was still hiding his wife. The dynamic had shifted from deception to a tense, armed stalemate. For 2 weeks, a brittle new routine took hold. Madame Lee stopped her open contempt. She addressed Amina formally, if coldly. The deportation order was quietly shelved, but the house was now a prison of unspoken truths. Jai-hun, reeling from the confrontation, wanted to finally reveal their marriage to end the charade. Amina warned against it. She accepted a blackmail, not a daughter-in-law. Force it now, and she'll find a way to burn the whole world down, herself included. They were stuck. The power to expose the Choi secrets gave Amina safety, but it also cemented her role as an enemy combatant, not a family member. She had traded daily humiliation for a cold, permanent siege. Then the first counterattack came, not from Madame Lee, but from the world outside. Chairman Choi Min-ho, furious that the marriage alliance had evaporated, began digging. His resources dwarfed even Madame Lee's. He wanted leverage. His investigators, looking for any scandal to pressure Jai-hun, started with the household staff, the easiest point of entry. They interviewed the gardener, the driver, the old butler. They asked pointed questions about the foreign maid. Was she treated specially? Did the young master interact with her unusually? The butler, loyal to Madame Lee, stonewalled. The gardener, grateful to Amina, said nothing. But the driver, a new hire, had noticed things. The way Jai-hun sometimes lingered in the hallway when Amina was cleaning. The lack of security checks on her personal belongings. It was circumstantial, but it was a thread. Choi's men pulled the thread. They cross-referenced flight manifests and found a single first-class ticket from Berlin to Seoul under the name Dr. Amina Nwachukwu, purchased by Jai-hun's corporate card 2 days before the maid arrived. Then they found the Danish marriage registry, a public record Jai-hun had foolishly believed was obscure enough to be safe. The discovery hit Choi's desk on a rainy Friday afternoon. He didn't see a scandal. He saw a weapon of exquisite precision. He didn't confront Jai-hun. He invited Madame Lee to tea. The meeting was at a secluded, members-only club in Cheongdam-dong. Choi was all polite smiles and condolences. "I was so sorry to hear the courtship with my Yuna wouldn't proceed. Young people today, so unpredictable." Then, without changing his tone, he slid a manila folder across the table. It contained the flight receipt and the marriage certificate. "It seems your son has a unique taste in household staff and a troubling habit of fraud, sponsoring a wife on a domestic worker visa. That's a serious immigration crime. It could lead to prison time, not just deportation. He watched the blood drain from Madame Lee's face. I want the merger on my original terms, a 51% controlling share for my group, and you will publicly endorse Yuna as a suitable match for your son to restore our family's honor. Do this, and this folder disappears. Your son avoids prosecution. Your family avoids a humiliation that would make you a laughingstock from here to Jongno. The trap had sprung, and the jaws were not Choi's, but her own son's actions. Madame Lee returned to the penthouse in a state of cold fury. She had been outflanked. Her enemy now held the very scandal she had tried to prevent. She summoned Jai-hun and threw the folder at him. You idiot, you romantic fool, you didn't just marry her. You left a paper trail a child could follow. For the first time, Jai-hun saw genuine fear in his mother's eyes, not for his happiness, but for the survival of their family's legacy. He argued, he raged. We'll go public first. We'll control the narrative. His mother laughed, a brittle, horrible sound. Control it? As what? The billionaire who illegally smuggled in his African bride to be his mother's slave? The press will eat you alive. The board will oust you. Choi will get his merger anyway from the rubble. Amina, listening from the hallway, understood the new calculus. Her blackmail against Choi was now useless. Exposing his corruption would only ensure he exposed their marriage in retaliation, a mutually assured destruction that would still destroy Jai-hun. They needed a third option. That night in their hidden room, she proposed the unthinkable. We have to give her what she wants. Jai-hun stared, horrified, but Amina continued. Not the marriage to Yuna, the legacy. We give her a way to save face, to spin this as a victory, not a defeat. We make your marriage to me an asset she can't afford to lose. Her plan was audacious. It leveraged the one thing they had that Choi didn't, Amina's mind. The merger was about integrating Jai-hun's AI logistics platform with Choi's old industrial supply chains. It was stalling because Choi's people didn't understand the tech. Amina proposed that she, as a consulting specialist from the acquiring firm, be embedded in the merger team. She would use her expertise to secure better terms, to find efficiencies Choi's people missed, value so clear and quantifiable that the financial win would overshadow the social scandal for the board and the investors. She would make herself indispensable to the very deal that was meant to crush them. And she would do it from the inside, where she could also quietly monitor Choi's countermoves. Jai-hun was terrified. It put her directly in Choi's crosshairs, but they were out of choices. He presented the plan to his mother as a business proposition, stripped of all emotion. Amina is not a maid. She is a strategic asset. Deploy her. If she fails, you lose nothing. If she succeeds, you gain everything and Choi loses his leverage. Madame Lee studied her son, then the ceiling, weighing a lifetime of prejudice against the cold hunger for victory. Finally, she said, if she is recognized, if this fails, you will both be on your own. I will deny I knew anything. It was the closest she would come to permission. The following Monday, Dr. Amina Nwachukwu, in a tailored suit, her locks styled in an elegant crown braid, walked into the Kang Holdings headquarters. Her employee badge listed her as a special projects lead from the Berlin office. The few who knew the maid did a double take, but the transformation was too complete. In the merger war room, she was a force of nature. She dissected complex data models, predicted supply chain bottlenecks with uncanny accuracy, and drafted clauses that protected Jai-hun's intellectual property in ways his lawyers had missed. Within a week, the negotiation tide turned. Choi's team was flustered, outmatched. Chairman Choi himself attended a session, and his eyes narrowed as he watched this brilliant, unfamiliar black woman dismantle his positions. He didn't recognize the maid, but he sensed a threat. He ordered his investigators to find out who she really was. The pressure was immense. Amina lived two lives, the consultant by day, the hidden wife by night, retreating to the servant's wing. The strain began to show. Jai-hun, watching her excel in his world, fell in love with her all over again, and the injustice of their situation became unbearable. He bought a simple gold band and in their hidden room placed it on her finger beside her original wedding ring. Someday, he promised, you'll wear this one outside. It was a small act of defiance that carried immense risk. That risk materialized through Yuna Choi. Curious about the woman outmaneuvering her father's best men, Yuna arranged a casual coffee. It was a tense, fascinating meeting. Yuna was sharp, ambitious, and deeply frustrated with her father's outdated empire. She and Amina talked tech, then art, then the stifling expectations of their respective worlds. A wary respect formed. As they parted, Yuna said casually, "You know, you remind me of someone, a researcher I admired in grad school." She vanished from academia. She left the statement hanging, a question and a warning. She knew, or she was dangerously close. The crisis point arrived during the final merger negotiations. A critical data set was corrupted, sabotage suspected from Choi's team to force a delay and better terms. The entire deal was poised to collapse. Jaihan's team worked through the night, failing. At 3 a.m., Amina, working from the penthouse study, had a breakthrough. She reconstructed the data using an arcane algorithm from her doctoral work. She saved the deal. Elated, Jaihan burst into the study, grabbed her, and kissed her, a deep, relieved, loving kiss. And in that moment of triumph and exhaustion, they forgot the most important rule. They were not alone. Madame Li had come down for tea. She stood frozen in the doorway, a silver cup in her hand, witnessing the undeniable truth of her son's passion. The mask was gone. She saw not a strategic asset or a scheming maid, but a man in love with his wife. The teacup shattered on the marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot. Jaihan and Amina broke apart, staring at the shattered porcelain and the ashen face of the matriarch. Madame Li didn't scream. She didn't cry. She whispered, "Get out." They thought she meant them, but she pointed a trembling finger at Amina. Get her out of my sight. Now. The old prejudice, wounded and furious, had reawoken, stronger than any business calculation. But as Jaihan stepped forward to defend his wife, the house phone rang. It was the head of security. Paparazzi, a dozen of them, had surrounded the service entrance. Someone had tipped them off. The tip claimed the Li family was hiding an illegal immigrant worker involved in a scandal. It was Choi's final move. He couldn't prove the marriage yet, but he could force a public scene, a police investigation, 1,000 flashbulbs exposing the maid. They were trapped. If Amina left, she'd be swarmed and her visa fraud exposed. If she stayed, the police might be called. Madame Li looked from the window at the gathering media, to her son's desperate face, to the woman who had just saved his empire. Her lifetime of social fear warred with a new, grudging understanding. The world was at her gate, demanding a sacrifice. She had minutes to decide who she would throw to them. She took a deep breath, straightened her hanbok, and turned to Amina with a terrifying, unreadable calm. "Go to my dressing room, top drawer. Bring me the red lacquer box." This was not the end of the war. It was the moment the battlefield changed forever. What was in that box would either condemn them all or rewrite every rule of the game they were playing. Amina moved, the world moving in slow motion around her. The dressing room was a museum of Madame Li's life, silk, perfume, and the cold glint of jewelry. The red lacquer box was heavy, ancient. She brought it back. Madame Li took it, her hands steady now, and placed it on the console table. She didn't open it. Instead, she looked at her son. "You will go downstairs. You will stand at the main entrance. You will say nothing. You will let them take their pictures." Then she turned to Amina, "And you will stand beside him." Jaihan's eyes widened. "Mother, it is the only move left." She cut him off, her voice like carved stone. "Choi thinks he is exposing a crime. We will give him a wedding." Plan was insane, suicidal, to walk out arm in arm before the flashing lights and simply be seen, to preempt the scandal by owning it but without a story, without a defense. It was a blank canvas for the press to paint with every racist, classist assumption they had, but Madame Li was already dialing a number on her private line. "Minister Park, yes, for the favor you owe my husband, I need the immigration commissioner on the phone in 5 minutes, and the editor of the Chosun Ilbo." "Yes, it is that kind of night." She hung up. The box remained closed. "The box is not for them," she said, answering the unasked question. "It is for after. Now go, and for God's sake, stand up straight." The walk to the front door was the longest of their lives. Through the grand foyer, past the staring staff, Jaihan reached for Amina's hand. His palm was damp. Hers was dry, cold. He pushed the heavy oak door open. The explosion of light was physical, a wall of shouts, flashes, lenses pushing forward against the security line. "CEO Li, is it true you're hiding an illegal worker? Who is the woman?" For a moment, they were blinded, frozen in the glare. Then Jaihan spoke, his voice amplified by the mansion's external speakers, a system he never knew his mother had activated. "This is Dr. Amina Nwachukwu," he said, the title deliberate, a shield. "She is a valued specialist consulting on the Kang Holdings merger. Any allegations otherwise are false and defamatory." It was a holding statement, thin as rice paper. The shouts grew louder, more aggressive. Then why is she living here? Are you romantically involved? The question hung in the air, a trap. Before Jaihan could walk into it, a new voice spoke from behind them. Madame Li stood in the doorway, backlit, every inch the Dowager Queen. She had changed. She wore not a hanbok, but a severe modern pantsuit. In her hand, she held a single sheet of paper. She stepped between her son and the cameras, facing the frenzy. The crowd quieted, sensing a bigger kill. "You are here because you were fed a lie by a failing businessman trying to salvage a bad deal," she announced, her voice crisp and clear. "The woman beside my son is his wife." The silence was absolute, broken only by the whirring of cameras. She had not said it kindly. She had stated it as a fact, a tactical detonation. They were married in a private ceremony in Denmark last year. For personal security reasons during a sensitive merger, this was not publicized. The narrative of illegal maid is a malicious fabrication by Choi Min-ho, who sought to derail negotiations. "I have here," she raised the paper, "a formal cease and desist from my lawyers and a report to the financial regulator detailing Choi's attempt at commercial blackmail and his own creative accounting." Masterstroke, she had reframed the entire scandal. It was no longer about race or secret marriages. It was a boardroom drama. The villain was Choi. Her son was a romantic, perhaps foolish for the secrecy but not a criminal. And Amina was transformed from a vulnerable illegal worker into a protected, legitimate wife, a victim of corporate espionage. The reporters' questions shifted instantly. "Do you have proof of the marriage? What is your response to Chairman Choi?" Madame Li simply nodded to Jaihan. He, understanding, produced his phone, found a photo, their simple civil ceremony in Copenhagen, and held it up. The flashes erupted again, but the tone had changed. The story was writing itself. Billionaire's secret romance foils rivals' dirty tricks. Back inside, with the doors closed, the performance fell away. Jaihan was trembling with adrenaline. Amina felt hollow. Madame Li walked to the study, the three of them following in a daze. Only then did she open the red lacquer box. It contained no jewels. It held a stack of aged documents and a single faded photograph. She laid them on the desk. The photo was of a young Korean woman and a black American soldier, holding hands in a Seoul park, circa 1970. The woman was unmistakably a youthful Soojin. "His name was James," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I was 19, my family found out. They sent me to Japan for a year. He was transferred, I never saw him again." She looked at Amina, not with warmth, but with a bleak, shared understanding. "I learned then that love is a luxury my world does not permit. I thought I was protecting my son from that same pain. I was wrong. I was preserving my own." The confession hung in the air, recontextualizing every cruel word, every barrier. Her prejudice wasn't just societal, it was a scar. Jaihan stared at his mother, seeing a stranger. Amina felt a confusing surge of pity. This was the final, surprising truth. The matriarch was a refugee from her own heart. "The documents," Madame Li continued, tapping the papers, "are not about me. They are the complete, unedited forensic audit of Choi Min-ho's conglomerate, prepared by an international firm I hired the day he threatened me. It details tax evasion, bribery, and violations of international sanctions. It is enough to send him to prison for 20 years. He will be silent now." The aftermath was a whirlwind. Choi, faced with the audit, withdrew all claims and accepted the merger on Jaihan's terms. The press, having gotten a juicier story of corporate warfare and a secret wedding, lost interest in the maid angle. The immigration issue was quietly fixed with a hefty consultant's fee and a new proper spouse visa. The social scandal, however, was real. Invitations dried up. Whispered comments followed Madame Li at the few events she attended. But a curious thing happened. A segment of the public, particularly younger Koreans, saw the story differently. They saw a powerful mother defending her son's choice, a successful black professional, a love story against the odds. A minor women's magazine even profiled Amina, not as a maid, but as a tech pioneer and modern Korean bride. The real change was in the penthouse. The servants' wing room was emptied. Amina moved into Jaihan's suite openly. The first dinner as a public family was agonizingly quiet. Then Madame Li spoke. "The jangu drums in the music room, they have not been played in 15 years. My husband was the musician I never learned." She looked at Amina. "You have strong hands, and you are not afraid of complex systems." It was not an apology, it was an invitation. The next afternoon, Amina sat before the drum, watching online tutorials, her hands fumbling at first, then finding a rhythm. The deep, resonant asterisk dong filled the silent apartment. From the hallway, Madame Li listened, her eyes closed. A single tear traced a path through her powder. It was the sound of a gate opening, not with a victory shout, but with a hesitant, shared beat. 6 months later, the merger was a hailed success, largely due to the integrated systems Amina had designed. At the launch party held at the penthouse, Madame Li stood at the head of the room. Guests mingled, a mix of old money and new tech. Yuna Choi was there, having struck out on her own, now a client of Amina's new data consultancy. The crowd hushed as Madame Li raised a glass. "To the future," she said. Then she added, her eyes finding Amina across the room, "and to the new minds that will build it." It was the closest to a blessing she would ever give. Later that night in the garden, Jai-hun slipped the simple gold band onto Amina's finger. This time it stayed on. The moon was bright. From the open window above, the soft, practiced sound of a Django rhythm floated down, a little clumsy but steadily improving. Inside, Madame Li was practicing. The house was no longer a fortress. It was a work in progress. The war was over. The difficult daily peace had begun, and it started, as all things do in Korea, with the delicate, terrifying art of saving face. Only this time, they were all saving each other's. The story of the billionaire, the maid, and the secret wedding is more than a scandal. It is a perfect pressure test for a society in transition. South Korea, a nation that once proudly called itself a single-race family, now sees one in every 10 marriages as international. Yet, as our research showed, 68% of foreign residents still report facing discrimination. The Lee family's drama, fictional in its extremes, mirrors a real and painful tension between the deep, centuries-old fear of cultural dilution and the undeniable, accelerating force of a connected world. What makes this story resonate is not the wealth or the deception, but the universal question it poses. How far would you go to protect the person you love from the world you come from? For Jai-hun, it was a lie that degraded his wife. For Amina, it was the swallowing of 1,000 humiliations. For Madame Li, it was the confrontation with her own buried history. Their extreme choices hold up a mirror to more ordinary prejudices, the quiet discomforts, the unspoken rules, the times we choose social peace over personal truth. The real shock, perhaps, is not that a mother-in-law was racist, but that she was also a prisoner. Her redemption didn't come from a sudden change of heart, but from a brutal cost-benefit analysis. She accepted Amina not when she saw her as a worthy person, but when she saw her as a necessary asset. It was a start. And sometimes, in the rigid hierarchies of family and tradition, a transactional peace is the only bridge to something real. The drums in the music room are not yet played in harmony, but they are no longer silent. This is the new frontier of social change, not in grand protests, but in quiet, agonizing negotiations behind closed penthouse doors. It happens in the moment a son refuses to bend, a wife refuses to leave, and a matriarch, faced with the ruin of everything she built, chooses to recalculate. The world is not changed by the absence of prejudice, but by the presence of a greater necessity. Love, in the end, can be one of those necessities. If this story of hidden identities and shattered expectations gripped you, there are more like it waiting. The collision of old money and new love, of tradition and rebellion, is a drama playing out in every corner of the globe. Subscribe now and tap the bell. We delve into the secrets they never wanted you to know.